They called her the devil's daughter, but the devil never smelled like lye soap and moth-eaten wool. She was a stain on polite society, a creature meant to be locked in damp manners and forgotten. Then came the Duke of Kendall. He didn't want a bride. He wanted a quiet life. But a single jagged laugh, a sound like a rusted hinge breaking open, ripped through his boredom. It changed everything. Stick around because this isn't a fairy tale. The solarium was freezing. It was the kind of damp cold that lived in the mortar of the stones, sinking through the soles of Morwenna's boots and gnawing at her ankles. She pushed a heavy iron needle through the backing of an ancient, rotting tapestry. The canvas groaned. Dust, smelling of dried lavender and decades of dead spiders, puffed into the frigid air. Morwenna didn't sneeze. She just pulled the coarse wool thread tight, her knuckles white, the calluses on her fingertips catching on the fibers. Below her, in the courtyard, the gravel crunched under heavy carriage wheels. The estate of Highcross had been sold. No, not sold. Liquidated. Stripped down to its copper pipes and threadbare rugs to pay the debts her father had left behind before he swung from a gallows in London. Treason, they called it. Devilry, the locals whispered. He had dabbled in politics and the occult with equal disastrous ineptitude. Morwenna inherited nothing but his dark hair, his sharp jaw, and the suffocating weight of his ruin. She paused her sewing, resting her forehead against the icy glass of the solarium window. Below, rain lashed against the cobblestones in sideways sheets. 3 men in heavy dark riding cloaks dismounted. The horses were steaming, their flanks heaving, lather dripping from their bits. The man in the center didn't wait for a groom. He tossed his reins to a panicked-looking footman and stalked toward the heavy oak doors of the manor. He walked with a pronounced limp, his left leg dragging slightly, his boots striking the stone with an uneven, aggressive rhythm. Desmond, the Duke of Kendall, the new owner of Highcross. Morwenna exhaled, leaving a fog on the glass. She rubbed it away with the heel of her hand. Her dress, a dull, faded navy wool that smelled faintly of vinegar and old smoke, was missing 2 buttons at the collar. She didn't bother trying to pin it. What did it matter? She came with the house, a leftover liability, a spinster ward of 24, who the lawyers had legally obligated the new owner to house until she died or married, and the devil's daughter was not going to marry. She turned back to the tapestry. It depicted a hunting scene, men on horseback chasing a desperate, bug-eyed stag. Morwenna was currently mending the stag's bleeding flank with crimson thread. She liked the stag. It knew exactly how screwed it was. For 2 days, the manor descended into a chaotic, muted panic. Servants scurried. Floorboards were scrubbed until the smell of caustic lye burned the back of the throat. Morwenna stayed in the solarium. It was an unspoken agreement. Keep the vain woman out of sight. Don't let her infect the Duke's new investment with her bad luck. She survived on cold mutton and stale bread brought up by a sympathetic kitchen maid. She sewed. She watched the gray light shift across the floorboards. She listened. The Duke was not a quiet man. His voice carried through the drafty ventilation shafts, a low, gravel-heavy baritone that vibrated with perpetual irritation. He complained about the dry rot in the east wing. He demanded to know why the wine cellar smelled like a stagnant pond. He fired the groundskeeper on a Tuesday morning. She heard the man weeping in the courtyard. He was dismantling her childhood, brick by rotting brick, and Morwenna felt absolutely nothing. It was a relief, really. Let him tear it down. On the 3rd afternoon, the erratic rhythm of his boots echoed on the spiraling iron staircase leading up to the solarium. Click, drag, click, drag. Morwenna's hand froze mid-stitch. The needle bit into her thumb. A tiny bead of blood welled up, bright against her pale skin. She wiped it on her skirt, leaving a rust-colored streak, and kept her eyes locked on the tapestry. The door hinges whined. The draft that followed smelled of rain, wet leather, and stale tobacco. I was told, a voice rasped from the doorway, that this floor was empty, a structural hazard, the architect called it. Morwenna didn't turn around. She pushed the needle through the canvas. The architect is a coward, Your Grace. The floorboards are soft, but the joists are oak. They'll hold a man's weight, even a heavy one. A long silence. The sound of shifting leather. Then, the uneven tread across the floorboards. He stopped about 5 feet behind her stool. You're the vain woman. It wasn't a question. Morwenna, she said, pulling the thread taut. If you intend to evict me, I'll need an hour to pack. I only have one trunk. I don't break legal contracts, even the inconvenient ones. He stepped closer. She could hear his breathing. It was slightly labored, a faint wheeze in his chest, probably from the cold. What are you doing to that rag? Mending it. It's rotting from the inside out. Burn it. Morwenna finally stopped. She turned her head, looking over her shoulder. Desmond of Kendal was not a handsome man. He was built like a battering ram, wide-shouldered and thick-necked. His face was a landscape of harsh angles, weathered skin, and a jagged pale scar that cut through his left eyebrow. His eyes were the dull, flat gray of a lead pipe. His hair, a messy ash blonde, was damp with rain. He looked exhausted, annoyed, and entirely unyielding. She looked back at the tapestry. It keeps the drafts out of the drawing room. I'm tearing the drawing room down, he stated bluntly. The foundation is sinking. Then I suppose I'm mending this for nothing, she said, her voice flat. She drove the needle into the fabric again. Much like your survey of this estate. It's a sinkhole, Your Grace. The Moors will swallow it in 50 years. You bought a very expensive puddle. He let out a short, sharp exhale, not quite a laugh, a bark of acknowledgement. Finally, someone in this damp, God-forsaken tomb who tells the truth. The Duke did not leave. Instead, he pulled a wooden crate from the corner, dragged it across the floor with a grating screech, and sat down. The wood groaned under his weight. Morwenna felt the hair on the back of her neck rise. She wasn't used to company. She was used to being stared at, whispered about, or entirely ignored. She was the ghost of High Cross. Ghosts weren't supposed to have an audience. He pulled a tin case from his coat pocket, flipped it open with his thumb, and extracted a dark, twisted cigar. He lit it with a sulfur match, the pungent smell briefly overpowering the lavender dust in the room. Do you mind? He asked, waving the match out. Would it matter if I did? No. Morwenna kept sewing. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, punctuated only by the wet sound of him pulling on the cigar and the soft shh of her thread pulling through canvas. She could feel his eyes on her, not roaming, just heavy, fixed on her hands. They call you the devil's daughter in the village, he said suddenly. Morwenna didn't flinch. I'm aware. They say your father sacrificed goats in the cellar. Only chickens, she replied deadpan, not missing a stitch. Goats were too expensive, and they bite. Desmond chewed on the end of his cigar. They also say you're cursed, that any man who touches you will lose his fortune. Morwenna dropped her hands into her lap. She turned on her stool, facing him fully. The gray light from the window washed over her, highlighting the sharp hollows of her cheeks and the dark, bruised-looking circles under her eyes. Are you worried for your fortune, Your Grace? She asked. Her voice was quiet, dripping with cold sarcasm. Or are you just taking inventory of the local folklore? He studied her. He didn't look at her like a woman. He looked at her the way he had looked at the cracked foundation outside, assessing the damage, calculating the cost. I don't believe in curses, he said. I believe in bad investments. Your father was a bad investment. He backed the wrong political horse, panicked, and tried to buy his way out with secrets he didn't own. Stupidity isn't supernatural. A strange, tight knot in Morwenna's chest loosened just a fraction. It was the first time in 6 years someone had spoken of her father without crossing themselves or dropping their voice to a whisper. It was just a fact, a stupid, fatal fact. No, she agreed quietly, it isn't. She turned back to the tapestry, suddenly needing something to do with her hands. She attacked a tear near the top of the canvas, where a badly woven hound was chasing the stag. The hound looked deformed, its snout squashed, one eye higher than the other. Desmond stood, the crate scraping the floor again. He walked up to the tapestry, standing right beside her. He smelled strongly of the cigar smoke and old wool. He pointed a thick, calloused finger at the hound she was working on. "Are you wasting thread on that?" he asked. "It's part of the scene. It looks like a pig with a toothache." Morwenna stopped. She stared at the badly woven hound, the squashed snout, the uneven, bulging eyes. She had spent 2 hours trying to fix its leg yesterday, and he was right. It looked absolutely ridiculous. A pig with a toothache. The absurdity of it all. The rotting house. The damp air. The gruff Duke standing beside her, criticizing a 200-year-old botched weaving job while she sat there in a ruined dress. Hit her all at once. She tried to swallow it. She bit the inside of her cheek. She clamped her jaw shut, but the pressure built in her chest, sharp and frantic. It slipped out. It wasn't a delicate sound. It wasn't a pretty feminine giggle. It was a harsh, jagged snort that broke into a rusty, uneven laugh. It sounded like a hinge that hadn't been oiled in a decade being violently forced open. It was loud, awkward, and terribly real. Morwenna clapped a hand over her mouth, her eyes widening in mortification. Her shoulders shook. She couldn't stop. The sound echoed in the empty solarium. Desmond went entirely still. The cigar smoke curled slowly around his face. He turned his head and looked down at her. The flat gray of his eyes had shifted. The boredom was gone. Morwenna forced the laugh down, swallowing hard, her face burning. She wiped a tear of mirth from the corner of her eye, refusing to look at him. She expected him to leave. She expected him to be disgusted by the harshness of the sound. "I apologize," she muttered, picking up her needle with trembling fingers. I haven't." "Do that again," he said. His voice was lower than before, rougher. Morwenna froze. She looked up at him. "What?" "Laugh." She stared at him, her heart suddenly knocking against her ribs. The amusement vanished, replaced by a deep, instinctual caution. "I'm not a performing monkey, Your Grace." Desmond held her gaze for a long moment. The muscle in his jaw twitched. He looked back at the tapestry, then down at her hands, taking in the calluses, the dirt under her fingernails, the blood stain on her skirt. "No," he said softly, almost to himself. "You aren't." He turned and walked away. The uneven rhythm of his boots retreated down the iron stairs, leaving Morwenna alone in the cold, her pulse hammering in her throat, the smell of his cigar lingering like a warning. The summons came 2 days later. A footman, looking terrified to even be on the same floor as her, knocked on her bedroom door and pushed a folded note under the gap. The library. Noon. K. Morwenna sat on the edge of her lumpy mattress, staring at the thick cream-colored paper. Her stomach pitched. He was throwing her out. He had found a legal loophole. The brief moment of levity in the solarium meant nothing. He had assessed the estate, realized the burden she presented, and was ready to cut the rod away. She didn't change her dress. She didn't pinch her cheeks to bring color to them. She washed her hands with the harsh lye soap, tied her dark hair back with a piece of scrap ribbon, and walked down the grand staircase. The library was at the end of the west wing. The door was ajar. She pushed it open. The room was surprisingly warm. A massive fire roared in the hearth, spitting sparks against the iron grate. Desmond was standing by the window, staring out at the relentless drizzle. He had shed his riding coat and stood in a white linen shirt, the sleeves rolled up to the elbows, exposing thick forearms, dusted with blonde hair and a network of pale scars. He held a glass of amber liquid in one hand. "Shut the door," he said, without turning around. Morwenna closed it. The heavy oak shut with a solid thud, cutting off the sounds of the servants in the hall. She stood near the threshold, her hands clasped tightly in front of her to hide their shaking. "You wanted to see me, Your Grace." He turned. He looked tired. The dark shadows under his eyes made the scar on his brow stand out starkly. He set the glass down on a mahogany desk, strewn with architectural plans and ledgers. "Sit." He pointed to a leather armchair near the fire. "I prefer to stand for my evictions." Desmond let out a huff of air. He leaned against the edge of the desk, crossing his arms over his chest. You aren't being evicted, Morwenna, though your complete lack of self-preservation is noted. She bristled slightly at his use of her first name, the casual drop of formalities. Then why am I here? He didn't answer immediately. He stared at her, that same heavy, calculating look from the solarium. He looked at the frayed hem of her dress, the defensive set of her shoulders, the way she refused to look away from him. I am 38 years old, he began, his voice flat, factual. I inherited a dukedom I never wanted because my older brother broke his neck in a steeplechase. I have a ruined leg from a boar hunt. I despise London. I hate polite society. And I have exactly zero patience for the simpering, calculating daughters of the peerage who look at me and see a bank vault with a limp. Morwenna frowned, her brows drawing together. I fail to see how this concerns me. It concerns you, Desmond said, pushing off the desk and taking a slow, uneven step toward her. Because the entailment of my estate requires an heir. My lawyers have been haranguing me for 3 years to marry. If I don't, the title passes to a cousin in Bath who collects porcelain dogs and bankrupts himself at the faro tables. Morwenna's grip on her own hands tightened. The warmth of the fire suddenly felt suffocating. The smell of burning pine pitch and the sharp scent of his whiskey filled the space between them. So, Mary, she said, you are a duke. Throw a rock in Mayfair and you'll hit 3 women willing to overlook your disposition for a coronet. I don't want a woman who overlooks things, he said harshly. He stepped closer. I want a woman who sees the rot and isn't afraid of it. I want a woman who doesn't expect me to be a gentleman, because I'm not one. I want someone who won't shrink when I raise my voice, who won't demand poetry, and who understands that life is mostly just surviving the damp. He stopped 2 feet away from her. He was massive up close. Morwenna had to tilt her head back to look him in the eye. I'm asking you to marry me, Morwenna. The words dropped into the room like lead weights. Morwenna stared at him. The fire crackled loudly. She waited for the punchline. She waited for the sneer, the cruel twist of the mouth. But his face was utterly serious, the gray eyes unblinking. A sudden hot anger flared in her chest. She reached down and picked at a splinter on the edge of a nearby bookshelf. This is a joke, she said, her voice trembling slightly. A cruel one. You want to humiliate the devil's daughter. I don't have the energy for cruelty, he replied simply. Then you are mad. I am ruined. My family name is poison. I have no dowry, no standing, and I am entirely unsuited to be a duchess. I don't need a duchess. I need a wife. Why me? She snapped, stepping toward him, her anger overtaking her caution. Because I don't scream when you walk into a room? Because I laughed at your joke? Is your ego so fragile that a single laugh from a spinster makes you want to leash yourself to her? Desmond didn't flinch. He reached out, his large, rough hand catching her wrist. Not hard, just enough to stop her pacing. His skin was warm, incredibly warm, because, he said, his voice dropping to a low rumble that vibrated in the quiet room. When you laughed, for 5 seconds, this miserable house didn't feel like a grave. Because you sew the wounds on ruined things, and because you are the only person I have met in 10 years who expects absolutely nothing from me. He let go of her wrist and took a step back, giving her space. It is a transaction, Desmond said, slipping back into his flat, businesslike tone. You get security. You will never freeze in a drafty solarium again. You will have clothes that don't smell of vinegar. You will have my name, which will shield you from the whispers. In return, you run my household, you tolerate my temper, and you give me an heir. That is the bargain. Morwenna looked at her wrist, where the ghost of his heat still lingered. She looked up at his scarred, exhausted face. He wasn't offering love. He was offering a life raft, built of rough timber and iron nails. And if I say no? She asked. Desmond walked back to his desk and picked up his whiskey. Then I leave you here, with your one trunk, and I sell the estate to a man who turns it into a sheep pasture. You will be relocated to a parish cottage. The choice is yours. He took a sip of the amber liquid. I leave for Kendal tomorrow at dawn. Be in the carriage, or don't. He turned his back to her, staring out the window again. The dismissal was absolute. Morwenna stood in the center of the room for a long time. The fire baked the left side of her face. She looked at his broad back, at the uneven slope of his shoulders. She was terrified. She was furious. And buried deep beneath the thick, calloused layers of her cynicism, she was desperately, overwhelmingly curious. She turned and walked out, closing the door quietly behind her. The dawn was the color of a bruised plum, dark purple and weeping rain, when Morwenna dragged her trunk across the threshold of High Cross. It was made of battered pine, the iron clasps rusted shut. It held 3 shifts, 2 drab dresses, a pair of worn boots, and a wooden box containing her father's brass compass, the only thing he hadn't sold or destroyed. She hauled it over the uneven stone steps, her breath pluming in the freezing air, the frayed hem of her cloak dragging in the mud. The carriage was already waiting in the courtyard. It was heavy, black, and entirely unadorned. No gilded crests, no velvet curtains. A pair of massive gray draft crosses stamped their hooves, their breath steaming up like smoke from a furnace. Desmond stood by the open carriage door. He wore a heavy wool greatcoat that smelled of wet sheep and cheap tobacco. He didn't offer a hand to help her down the steps. He didn't say a word of greeting. He simply gave a sharp nod to the footman, who scrambled forward to heave Morwenna's miserable trunk onto the rear rack. Morwenna climbed into the carriage unassisted. Her boots slipped on the iron step, her knee slamming hard against the doorframe. Pain bolted up her leg, bright and hot. She swallowed the gasp, biting down hard on her bottom lip, and hauled herself inside. She sat on the far side of the dark leather bench, rigid, arranging her damp skirts. Desmond climbed in after her. The carriage dipped violently under his weight. He slammed the door shut, knocking twice on the roof. The carriage lurched forward. They did not speak for the first 40 miles. The roads were a nightmare of deep ruts and thick, sucking mud. The carriage axle groaned continuously, a high mechanical whine that drilled into Morwenna's skull. The inside of the cabin was freezing. The air tasted of wet leather and Desmond's lingering cigar smoke. Morwenna kept her eyes glued to the window. The English countryside blurred past in smears of gray and dead brown. Every jolt of the wheels sent a fresh throb of pain through her bruised knee. She was starving. Her stomach let out a hollow, embarrassing growl. Across from her, Desmond shifted. He reached into the deep pocket of his coat, pulled out a linen parcel, and tossed it onto the bench beside her. It hit the leather with a dull thud. Morwenna stared at it. "Eat," he said. He didn't open his eyes. He had his head tipped back against the carriage wall, his bad legs stretched out stiffly in the narrow space between them. She unwrapped the linen. Inside was a hunk of hard cheese, half a loaf of crusty brown bread, and a pale, bruised apple. It wasn't a duke's fare. It was a traveler's ration. She broke the bread, the crust snapping loudly in the quiet cabin, and chewed. It tasted of salt and rye, and it was the best thing she had eaten in a week. "I expected more servants," she said quietly, her voice raspy from disuse. Desmond cracked one eye open. The gray iris caught the dull light from the window. "I don't travel with an entourage. They require feeding, they complain about the cold, and they talk too much. I prefer quiet." "Then you have made a terrible mistake marrying a woman." A heavy silence followed. Then the corner of his mouth twitched. It wasn't a smile, not exactly. It was a marginal relaxation of his jaw. "I didn't marry a woman, Morwenna. I married you." He closed his eye again. The journey took 2 grueling days. They stopped at nondescript coaching inns where Desmond rented 2 separate rooms, ate his mutton in silence, and drank black tea laced with whiskey. Morwenna slept in her clothes, too cold and too paranoid to undress. On the evening of the second day, the carriage began a steep, winding ascent. The trees grew sparse, replaced by jagged outcrops of granite and sweeping expanses of purple heather. The wind picked up, howling through the gaps in the carriage windows. It smelled different here. Sharp, bitter. It smelled of peat bogs, salt, and raw earth. "Garraway," Desmond announced, his voice slicing through the gloom. Morwenna pressed her face to the glass. Garraway Hall was not a palace. It was a fortress. It sat on the edge of a jagged cliff face, a massive, sprawling structure of dark gray stone that looked as though it had been clawed straight out of the earth. There were no manicured gardens, no delicate statues, just a high iron gate, a sweeping gravel drive, and the imposing, unyielding bulk of the manor silhouetted against a bruised, stormy sky. It looked exactly like the man sitting across from her. The carriage rattled over a stone bridge and pulled to a halt in the courtyard. The wind immediately rattled the doors. Desmond pushed the door open and stepped out into the freezing gale. He turned, looking back at her. This time he held out his hand. It was a large hand. The knuckles were scarred, the skin rough and weather-beaten. Morwenna looked at it for a long second. Her heart gave a sudden terrifying flutter against her ribs. This was the transaction. This was the moment she stepped off the precipice. She placed her hand in his. His grip was entirely devoid of gentleness. It was a vice. He pulled her down onto the gravel, his sheer mass shielding her from the biting wind. "Welcome to the end of the world," he said, his voice flat. He dropped her hand and limped toward the heavy oak doors. They were married the following morning in the estate's private chapel. It was a damp, vaulted room that smelled of mildew and centuries of unlit beeswax candles. The stones underfoot were freezing. Morwenna wore her best dress, the faded navy wool, which she had scrubbed at the cuffs and hem with a stiff brush until the fabric threatened to tear. The local vicar was a small, nervous man who smelled faintly of sour ale and mothballs. He kept dabbing at his sweating forehead with a grayish handkerchief, shooting terrified sideways glances at Desmond. Desmond wore a dark suit that fit him poorly across the shoulders, as if he had outgrown it years ago and refused to buy another. He leaned heavily on a silver-topped cane, his jaw locked, his eyes fixed on a crack in the altar stone. The ceremony was agonizingly fast. There was no music, no guests, just the harsh, echoing voice of the vicar stumbling over the liturgy and the howling wind rattling the stained glass windows. "Do you, Desmond?" The vicar squeaked, clearing his throat loudly. "Take this woman." "I do," Desmond interrupted, his voice a low, impatient gravel. The vicar blinked, clearly thrown off his script. He turned to Morwenna. "And do you—" "I do," she said. Her voice didn't shake. It was perfectly level, deadened by the surreal nature of the moment. Desmond reached into his waistcoat. He didn't have a velvet box. He simply pulled out a ring and shoved it onto her left hand. It was a thick, heavy band of old gold. It was entirely unadorned, devoid of diamonds or engravings, and it was 2 sizes too big. It slid loosely down to her knuckle, cold and heavy. "Right?" Desmond muttered. "Are we done?" "Yes, Your Grace," the vicar stammered. "I pronounce you man and wife." Desmond turned on his heel. His cane struck the stone floor. Clack, drag, clack, drag. He walked out of the chapel without looking back. Morwenna stood alone at the altar. She looked down at the heavy gold ring. It caught the weak gray light filtering through the window. She curled her hand into a fist to keep it from slipping off. The rest of the day passed in a blur of surreal, disjointed silence. The servants of Garraway, a hardened, quiet lot who moved like shadows, avoided her gaze. They served dinner in a cavernous dining room that could have seated 40 people. Desmond sat at one end, Morwenna sat at the other, 20 feet of polished mahogany between them. The soup was hot and tasted heavily of salt pork. They ate to the sound of silver scraping porcelain. When the grandfather clock in the hall struck 10, Desmond threw his napkin onto the table. "Go upstairs," he commanded. "First door on the right in the east gallery." Morwenna's stomach tied itself into a cold, hard knot. The transaction. "You give me an heir." She pushed her chair back. It scraped loudly against the floorboards. She walked up the grand staircase, her legs feeling like lead. The bedroom was massive. The walls were paneled in dark oak. A huge 4-poster bed dominated the space, draped in heavy forest green velvet. A fire burned sluggishly in the hearth, but it did little to combat the freezing drafts that leaked through the window frames. She stood in the center of the room. She didn't take off her dress. She didn't unpin her hair. She simply stood there, staring at the bed, her breath shallow. 20 minutes later, the door handle clicked. Desmond walked in. He looked exhausted. The limp was worse. He dragged his left leg entirely, leaning heavily on the door frame before shutting it behind him. He unfastened his cravat, pulling it loose with a rough jerk, and tossed it onto a nearby chair. He stopped. He looked at her. Morwenna was standing ramrod straight, her fists clenched at her sides, her jaw set so hard her teeth ached. She looked like a soldier awaiting a firing squad. Desmond let out a long, slow breath. He ran a hand over his face, dragging his fingers through his messy ash-blonde hair. He limped toward a heavy oak wardrobe, opened it, and pulled out a thick wool blanket. He walked over to where she stood and dropped the blanket onto her shoulders. It was heavy, smelling of cedar and dust. "You look like a cornered fox," he said bluntly. "I'm fulfilling my end of the contract, Your Grace. My name is Desmond. If you call me Your Grace in this room, I will throw you out the window." He stepped back, resting his weight on his good leg. He studied her face, the bruised shadows under her eyes, the rigid set of her shoulders, the way she was shivering despite the heavy wool. "I need an heir," he said, his voice quiet, devoid of its usual gruff edge. "I don't need a sacrifice. You look like you're about to snap in half." Morwenna blinked. The raw defensive anger that had been keeping her upright faltered. "I am perfectly capable. You are exhausted," he interrupted. "You haven't slept in 3 days. Your hands are shaking. And frankly, my leg is throbbing so badly I couldn't manage the physical exertion if I tried." He walked over to a chaise lounge positioned near the sluggish fire. It was too short for him, too narrow. He threw his heavy greatcoat over it, sat down, and unlaced his boots with a grunt of pain. "Get in the bed, Morwenna." She stared at him. "You are sleeping on the chaise?" "I have slept in muddy trenches in Flanders. The chaise is a luxury." He pulled a pillow from the main bed, tossed it onto the lounge, and stretched out. His bad leg hung awkwardly off the edge. "Turn down the lamp. The oil smells foul." Morwenna stood frozen for another long moment. A bizarre cocktail of emotions swirled in her chest. Relief, heavy and intoxicating, washed over her. But right behind it was a sudden, sharp prick of insult. Was she so entirely undesirable? Was the devil's daughter so wretched that even a man who needed an heir couldn't stomach the sight of her? She shoved the thought down. It was stupid. It was vanity. She walked over to the oil lamp and turned the brass dial, plunging the room into shadows lit only by the dying embers in the grate. She climbed into the massive bed, fully clothed, pulling the heavy green velvet covers up to her chin. The mattress was shockingly soft. The linen smelled of lavender and clean snow. Across the room, Desmond shifted, the chaise groaning under his weight. "Don't overthink it, Morwenna." His rough voice floated through the dark. "It isn't a rejection. It's pragmatism. Go to sleep." She closed her eyes. For the first time in 6 years, she felt perfectly, strangely safe. The peace lasted exactly until 9 o'clock the next morning. Morwenna woke to an empty room. The fire had burned down to gray ash. The blanket on the chaise was neatly folded. She sat up, her spine aching from sleeping in her stiff wool dress. She washed her face with freezing water from the porcelain pitcher on the washstand, dragged a bone comb through her tangled hair, and left the room. Garraway Hall by daylight was no less intimidating. The corridors were vast and drafty, lined with tapestries that were in infinitely worse condition than the one she had mended at Highcross. She found her way down the sweeping staircase, following the faint scent of baking bread and roasting oats. She pushed through a pair of swinging baize doors and stepped into the kitchens. The noise stopped instantly. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the massive room. 2 scullery maids froze mid-scrub at the slate sinks. A footman dropped a spoon with a loud clatter. By the massive iron stove stood the housekeeper, a tall, severe woman with iron-gray hair pulled back so tightly it stretched the skin of her forehead. Mrs. Higgins. Morwenna had seen her briefly upon arrival, a shadow lingering by the stairs. "Good morning," Morwenna said. Her voice sounded unnaturally loud in the silent, cavernous space. Mrs. Higgins slowly wiped her hands on her apron. She didn't curtsy. She didn't smile. She looked Morwenna up and down, her eyes catching on the mismatched too large gold ring on her left hand. "Your Grace?" Mrs. Higgins said. The words tasted like ash in her mouth. Morwenna felt the hostility like a physical blow. It was the same look the villagers at High Cross had given her, the wary, superstitious glare. They knew who she was. The gossip had outpaced the carriage. She was the vain woman, the traitor's spawn, the devil's daughter. "I require a cup of tea," Morwenna said, keeping her voice entirely flat. She would not shrink. She would not go back to the solarium. "Breakfast was served at 7 in the dining room, ma'am," Mrs. Higgins replied coldly. "The master has already eaten." "I'm not the master. I'm the mistress, and I require tea." Mrs. Higgins's jaw tightened. She jerked her chin at a terrified-looking maid. "Fetch a tray for her ladyship in the morning room." "I will take it in the study," Morwenna corrected. She didn't wait for a response. She turned and walked out, her back rigid, refusing to let them see her hands tremble. She found the study on the first floor. It was the only room in Garraway that felt lived in. The walls were lined with books, the leather bindings cracked and smelling of age. A massive mahogany desk sat in the center, buried under an avalanche of papers, architectural plans, and leather-bound ledgers. Morwenna walked to the desk. She looked at the top ledger. It was open. The handwriting was sharp, aggressive, and entirely illegible. It looked like a spider had dipped its legs in ink and suffered a seizure across the page. She pulled out the heavy leather chair and sat down. When the maid arrived 10 minutes later with a rattling silver tray, Morwenna had pushed Desmond's chaotic piles to the edges of the desk. She had found a clean piece of parchment, a freshly sharpened quill, and was methodically copying the butcher's receipts into a legible column. The maid dropped the tray on a side table and fled as if the room were on fire. Morwenna drank her tea black. It was scalding hot. She worked for 2 hours. She liked numbers. Numbers made sense. Numbers didn't whisper about curses or hangings. They just added up, or they didn't. Garraway, she quickly realized, was not adding up. The estate was hemorrhaging money on grain shipments that were double the market price, and the coal consumption recorded in the East Wing was high enough to heat a small cathedral, despite the rooms being entirely unheated. Someone was stealing, badly. The door swung open. Desmond stopped in the threshold. He wore his heavy riding boots, caked in fresh mud. His greatcoat was damp with drizzle. He carried a riding crop in one hand. He took one look at the organized desk, the stacked ledgers, and Morwenna sitting in his chair. His face darkened. The scar on his eyebrow pulled taut. "What are you doing?" he demanded, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "Good morning to you as well," Morwenna replied, not looking up from her column. She dipped the quill in the inkwell. Desmond crossed the room in 3 heavy, uneven strides. He slammed his hand flat on the desk. The inkwell jumped. "I asked you a question. Who told you to touch my ledgers?" Morwenna finally looked up. She didn't flinch. She met his furious gray eyes with dead, cold calm. "No one. But since your handwriting resembles a violent assault on the alphabet, I assumed you required assistance." He glared at her, breathing heavily through his nose. "I do not require assistance. I require a wife who does not meddle in my business. This is my business," Morwenna shot back, dropping the quill. She stood up. She was significantly shorter than him, but she refused to back away. "You purchased me, remember? You bought my time and my silence. In return, I am supposed to run this household. It is very difficult to run a household when your steward is blatantly robbing you blind." Desmond froze. The anger in his eyes fractured, replaced by a sudden sharp focus. "What did you say?" Morwenna tapped her finger hard against the page she had written. "Your grain merchant is overcharging you by 30%, and unless Mrs. Higgins is secretly operating a blast furnace in the East Wing, someone is selling your coal reserves on the black market." Desmond stared at her finger tapping the paper. He leaned down, squinting at the neat, precise columns she had drawn. The silence stretched. The only sound was the heavy ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall and the rain lashing against the window. He slowly straightened up. He looked at her, really looked at her. "You found that in 2 hours?" I found it in 40 minutes, Morwenna corrected coolly. I spent the rest of the time trying to decipher your notes regarding the sheep dip. A long pause. Then a low, rumbling sound began in Desmond's chest. It sounded like rocks grinding together. It took Morwenna a second to realize he was laughing. It wasn't a smile. It was a dark, harsh sound of pure, cynical amusement. He picked up the ledger, closed it with a snap, and tossed it to the side of the desk. Mrs. Higgins has been here for 20 years, he said, pulling out a cigar case. Then she has been stealing from you for 20 years. She terrified my mother. She terrifies the vicar. He struck a match off the edge of the fireplace mantel. Are you terrified of her, Morwenna? She is a housekeeper, Desmond, not a ghost. I've survived far worse than a woman with a bad temper and a taste for stolen coal. Desmond lit the cigar. He took a slow drag, blowing the smoke toward the ceiling. He looked at her through the haze. Fire her, he said. Morwenna blinked. What? You heard me. You run the household. Clean it out. If she gives you trouble, tell her I'll have the magistrate look at these ledgers. He turned and headed for the door, his limp pronounced but his shoulders somehow looking less burdened than they had 10 minutes ago. He stopped at the threshold and looked back. And Morwenna? Yes? My handwriting is perfectly legible. You just lack imagination. He shut the door behind him. Morwenna stood in the quiet study. The smell of his cigar smoke lingered in the air, sharp and pungent. She looked down at her neat, precise columns of ink. A slow, unfamiliar sensation bloomed in the center of her chest. It felt dangerous. It felt entirely, absurdly like a challenge. She picked up the ledger and headed for the kitchens. The kitchen was heavy with the smell of boiling cabbage and raw, bloody meat. When Morwenna pushed through the baize doors for the second time that day, the silence that followed was different. It wasn't just hostile, it was braced. The staff had heard the heavy, uneven tread of the Duke retreating. They knew something had fractured in the study. Mrs. Higgins was at the grand butcher's block, bringing a heavy iron cleaver down on a joint of mutton. Whack! The bone splintered. She didn't look up. Morwenna walked directly to the block. She placed the open ledger down on the flour-dusted wood, inches from the blood-stained meat. Pack your bags, Morwenna said. Mrs. Higgins froze, the cleaver buried in the wood. She looked at the ledger, then slowly dragged her eyes up to Morwenna. Her lip curled, revealing small, yellowed teeth. You do not give orders here, you cursed little wretch, the housekeeper hissed, dropping her voice to a venomous whisper so the scullery maids couldn't hear. I ran this house when the old Duke was alive. I ran it when this miserable cripple dragged himself back from the continent. You're a stray dog he picked up for breeding. You don't know your place. Morwenna didn't blink. She felt the cold draft from the larder biting at her ankles. She smelled the metallic tang of the raw mutton. Her heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs, but her voice came out like cracked ice. My place is in the master bedroom, Mrs. Higgins. Yours is on the high road. Morwenna tapped a finger against the ledger page. I have calculated the discrepancy in the coal shipments and the grain tolls. It amounts to nearly 400 pounds over the last 5 years. Grand theft, the penalty for which I believe is transportation to the colonies, or the gallows. The older woman's face blanched, the color draining from her sallow cheeks. He wouldn't. The Duke doesn't care about the books. He only cares about his moors and his quiet. He didn't care, Morwenna corrected. But I do, and he cares very much about what I tell him. She leaned in slightly, closing the distance between them. They call me the devil's daughter. They say my family is poison. My father swung from a rope for his arrogance. I watched his estate get stripped to the floorboards. You think you frighten me? You're just a thief with a heavy hand. Be gone by noon, or I will have the magistrate drag you out by your iron-gray hair. Mrs. Higgins stared at her. The malice in the older woman's eyes fractured into genuine panic. She looked at Morwenna's unblinking gaze, the dark circles, the absolute lack of bluff. Higgins yanked the cleaver from the wood, threw it onto the block, and marched out of the kitchen without a word. Morwenna stood perfectly still until the heavy oak door swung shut. Only then did she let out a shaky breath. She looked down at her hands. They were trembling violently. She gripped the edge of the butcher's block, the flour turning into paste against her damp palms. She turned to face the rest of the kitchen. 2 maids, a footman, and the cook were staring at her, wide-eyed and terrified. Morwenna straightened her spine. "The cabbage is burning," she said flatly. "Take it off the heat, and someone fetch me a fresh pot of tea. I have 3 more ledgers to audit." She walked out. From the shadows of the servants' stairwell, smelling faintly of wet wool and tobacco, Desmond watched her go. He leaned his weight heavily on his cane. A slow, dark smirk ghosted across his scarred face. He didn't say a word. He just turned and limped back toward the study, the sound of his cane muffled by the thick stone walls. 3 weeks passed. The transaction settled into a brutal, efficient rhythm. Morwenna gutted the household operations. She promoted a quiet, terrified scullery maid to head housekeeper simply because the girl could do basic arithmetic. She fired the grain merchant and contracted a local farmer at a fraction of the cost. She ordered the East Wing sealed to stop the drafts. Garraway Hall didn't become warm, but it stopped bleeding. Desmond stayed out of her way. He spent his days riding the moors in the freezing rain, assessing tenant farms and rebuilding dry stone walls with his bare, calloused hands. They ate dinner at opposite ends of the cavernous table. They spoke in clipped sentences about crop yields, roof slates, and the price of salt. At night she slept in the massive velvet bed. He slept on the cramped chaise lounge. He never touched her. He never asked for his heir. It infuriated her. She had braced herself for a brute. She had prepared for the grim reality of a marriage bed dictated by a contract. Instead, she got a silent, brooding lodger who treated her like a highly effective business partner. The relief she had felt on the first night was slowly souring into a strange, hollow ache. Was she truly that repulsive? A creature meant only for ledgers and cold logic. The answer came on a Tuesday in November, in the form of blood. The storm had been raging since dawn, a howling gale off the North Sea that rattled the windows in their frames. Morwenna was in the library trying to read a damp copy of a history text when the heavy front doors slammed open. The wind screamed through the hall. Morwenna dropped her book and ran out. Desmond was leaning against the stone archway of the entryway. He was entirely soaked, his greatcoat plastered to his broad frame. His face was the color of dirty chalk, and he was bleeding. A thick, dark stain was spreading down the left leg of his breeches, mixing with the mud and rainwater dripping onto the stone floor. He was breathing in harsh, ragged gasps, his eyes glassy and unfocused. "Desmond!" Morwenna rushed forward. She grabbed his arm. It felt like grabbing a block of freezing iron. He flinched, trying to pull away. "Or a horse slipped," he ground out, his teeth chattering violently. "Pinned the leg against a slate wall. It's fine. Just mud." "It is not fine, you stubborn idiot," she snapped, shoving her shoulder under his arm to brace him. His sheer weight nearly buckled her knees, but she locked her stance. "Walk, now." She practically dragged him up the stairs. By the time they reached the bedroom, Desmond was barely conscious. The cold had masked the pain, but the warmth of the fire in their room brought it roaring back. He collapsed onto the edge of the massive bed, his head hanging between his knees, groaning low in his throat. Morwenna didn't hesitate. "Take the coat off." She didn't wait for him to do it. She yanked the heavy sodden wool off his shoulders, dropping it to the floor. She knelt on the rug, her hands flying to the buckles of his mud-caked boots. "Don't," he slurred, pushing weakly at her shoulder. "Don't look at it. Fetch the doctor from the village." "The village is 10 miles away in a flood, Desmond. He won't make it. Let go of me." She shoved his hand away and pulled the boot off his left leg. The breeches were soaked through. She grabbed a pair of heavy iron shears from her sewing kit on the vanity and cut the fabric straight up the seam. Morwenna sucked in a sharp breath. The injury was bad. A jagged tear in the flesh of his calf, deep enough to show the white gleam of bone, sluggishly leaking dark blood. But that wasn't what made her stop. It was the rest of the leg. It was a ruin, a roadmap of unspeakable violence. Thick, ropey scars crisscrossed the muscle, divots of missing flesh from shrapnel or a boar's tusk. The skin was mottled, tight, and completely destroyed. It didn't look like a human limb. It looked like a battlefield that had been hastily sewn together and left to rot. Desmond let out a ragged exhale, turning his face away from her, staring at the wall. The shame radiating from him was palpable, suffocating. "I told you not to look," he whispered harshly. "It turns the stomach." Morwenna looked up at his averted face. She thought of the badly woven hound on the tapestry at High Cross, the broken thing that everyone else thought was useless, that she had spent hours trying to mend. "I have seen worse," she lied smoothly, keeping her voice completely devoid of pity. Pity would kill a man like this. "You are bleeding out on my clean linens. Sit still." She moved with frantic precision. She ran to the washstand, soaking a thick towel in the pitcher of cold water, and grabbed a bottle of carbolic acid from his shaving kit. She knelt back down, poured a liberal amount of the harsh, chemical-smelling acid onto the towel, and pressed it hard into the open wound. Desmond roared. It wasn't a shout. It was a guttural animal sound of pure agony. His hand shot out, gripping the wooden bedpost so hard the heavy timber creaked. His knuckles turned stark white. "Hold still," she commanded, pressing all her body weight onto the towel to stem the bleeding. "If you kick me, I will leave you to bleed." He didn't kick. He just shook, harsh tremors racking his massive frame as the acid burned out the mud and infection. Morwenna stayed knelt beside him for 2 hours. She cleaned the wound. She threaded her sewing needle with thick silk thread, the same thread she used to mend heavy wool cloaks, and sterilized it in the flame of a candle. "This is going to hurt," she said quietly. "Just do it," he ground out, his eyes squeezed shut, sweat pouring down his pale face. She sewed his flesh exactly as she had sewed the canvas at High Cross, methodical, unflinching. She ignored the way her own stomach churned, ignored the sticky heat of his blood coating her fingers. She just focused on pulling the edges of the ruin together. When she finally tied off the last knot and wrapped the leg in clean linen bandages, Desmond was unconscious, dragged under by the exhaustion and the pain. Morwenna sat back on her heels. Her dress was ruined, stained dark with his blood. Her hands were shaking again, but this time the tremor was absolute, bone-deep exhaustion. She looked at the man lying broken on the bed. The harsh lines of his face were slack. The perpetual anger was gone, leaving only the weariness. She dragged a heavy chair to the side of the bed. She didn't wash her hands. She just sat there, listening to the harsh, uneven rasp of his breathing, and watched the rise and fall of his chest until the gray dawn broke. The fever broke on the 3rd day. The room smelled of sweat, carbolic acid, and stale tea. The fire had died down to glowing red embers. Desmond opened his eyes. The ceiling came into focus slowly. His mouth tasted like old copper. His left leg throbbed with a dull, heavy heat, but the sharp, agonizing bite of infection was gone. He turned his head. Morwenna was slumped in the armchair beside the bed. She looked horrific. Her dark hair had escaped its pins, falling in a tangled, greasy mess over her shoulders. The dark circles under her eyes looked like bruises. She was wearing the same blood-stained navy dress she had worn 3 days ago. Her chin rested on her chest, her breathing shallow and even. Desmond stared at her. He had expected her to leave him to the servants. He had expected her to fulfill her managerial duties and keep a safe distance from the ugly, wretched reality of his physical ruin. That was the contract. Keep the books, run the house, stay out of the mud. Instead, she had waded directly into it. He slowly reached out a heavy, scarred hand. His joints ached. He brushed a tangled strand of dark hair away from her cheek. Morwenna woke instantly. She jerked upright, a defensive panic flaring in her eyes, her hands flying out as if to ward off a blow. "I'm awake," Desmond rasped. His voice sounded like a rusted saw. Morwenna blinked, her eyes focusing on his face. The panic vanished, replaced immediately by her usual ironclad mask. She sat back, clearing her throat and straightening her ruined skirt. "You have been unconscious for 3 days." she said briskly, avoiding his gaze. Your fever spiked twice. The wound is clean, but the stitches will need to stay for another week. I will have the kitchen send up broth. She moved to stand up, desperate to escape the heavy, suffocating intimacy of the quiet room. Desmond caught her wrist. His grip wasn't a vice this time. It was weak, trembling slightly from the fever, but it was enough to stop her. Sit down, he said quietly. I have ledgers to— Damn the ledgers, Morwenna. Sit down. She slowly lowered herself back into the chair. She looked at his hand wrapped around her wrist, at the contrast of his pale, scarred skin against the dark fabric of her sleeve. You sewed my leg, he said. It wasn't a question. The doctor couldn't make it. The river flooded. You didn't look away. Morwenna finally met his eyes. They weren't flat gray anymore. They were dark, swirling with something heavy and entirely unguarded. I told you, she said, her voice dropping to a defensive whisper. I have seen worse. No, you haven't, Desmond replied bluntly. He let go of her wrist, shifting his weight on the pillows with a wince. It's repulsive. I know what it looks like. I know what I am. A broken, angry man sitting on a pile of freezing rocks. You are a duke. I'm a cripple who had to buy a wife because no one else would look at him without flinching. His voice cracked like a whip in the quiet room. It was the loudest he had spoken in days. He fell back against the pillows, breathing heavily, his chest heaving. The ugly, bitter truth hung in the air between them, stripped of all its contractual, polite fictions. Morwenna stared at him. The carefully constructed walls inside her, the cynicism, the cold logic, the defensive sarcasm she used to survive the whispers, suddenly cracked. She leaned forward. You think I care about your leg? She hissed, her voice trembling with sudden, fierce anger. You think a scar terrifies me? My father sold my future to cover his gambling debts and then hung himself, leaving me to be treated like a rabid dog by every person in my life. You gave me a home. You gave me authority. You looked at me, and you didn't see the devil's daughter. You just saw me. She pointed a shaking finger at his chest. Do not insult me by pretending my silence is pity. I don't pity you, Desmond. I am furious with you. Desmond blinked. Why? Because you sleep on a chaise lounge that is a foot too short for you, she yelled, her composure entirely snapping. Because you eat alone. Because you treat me like a bank clerk instead of a wife. Because I signed a contract to give you an heir, and you treat me like glass. The silence that followed was deafening. Morwenna's chest heaved. She clamped her mouth shut, horrified by her own outburst. The jagged, rusty hinge had broken wide open, and all the mess she had kept locked inside was spilling out. Desmond stared at her. For a long, tense moment, neither of them moved. Then Desmond reached out. He grabbed the lapels of her ruined dress, ignoring the screaming pain in his leg, and hauled her forward. Morwenna gasped as she tumbled onto the mattress, her hand slapping against his chest to brace herself. Desmond didn't let her pull away. He brought his hands up, burying his fingers into the tangled mess of her dark hair, framing her face. And the contract is burned, he growled. He pulled her down. The kiss was not gentle. It was not polite. It tasted of fever sweat, carbolic acid, and desperate, starving need. It was a clash of teeth and rough hands, clumsy and frantic. Morwenna made a soft, choked sound in the back of her throat, her initial shock melting instantly into a fierce, consuming heat. She didn't pull away. She leaned into it, her hands sliding up to grip his broad shoulders, holding on to him like he was the only solid thing in a collapsing world. He kissed her like a man dying of thirst. She kissed him back like a woman who had finally found the warmth she had been denied her entire life. When they finally broke apart, both of them were breathing heavily. Morwenna rested her forehead against his, her hands still tangled in the collar of his shirt. Desmond's thumb brushed over her cheekbone, tracing the dark shadow under her eye. The anger was gone from his face. You are a terrifying woman, Morwenna, he murmured, his voice rough with emotion. Morwenna let out a small, jagged snort of a laugh. It sounded like a rusted hinge. And you are a terrible investment, Desmond. I know. He pulled her down against his chest, wrapping his heavy arms around her. Stay in the bed tonight. Only if you promise not to freeze me out." "I couldn't," he muttered, pressing his face into her hair. "Even if I tried." The storm raged on outside, battering the heavy stone walls of Garraway Hall. But inside, the fire had finally caught. The end. If this gritty, unapologetic romance gave you chills and proved that love isn't just about pretty words and perfect people, smash that like button right now. Drop a comment below telling me your favorite moment between Morwenna and Desmond. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss another raw, intense story. Share this video with a friend who needs a break from cliché fairy tales.